Thank you all for joining. We will go ahead and get started. And I'd like to just give you all a little bit of an introduction for the two speakers that we have joining us today. We have Mark Rademacher, who is a professor. He's an associate professor of strategic communication at Butler University here in Indianapolis in the College of Communication. He teaches undergraduate and graduate courses there, and he also serves as the chair of the Department of Strategic Communication and the graduate program. So we're really happy to have Mark because his research has investigated the intersection of identity, mass media, and consumer culture across a variety of contexts. And this really includes some findings on self-representation strategies that are utilized by marginalized populations. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Also with us today, we have Ola Ojewumi, who is a speaker, a writer, and an advocate. She has done a lot of great work representing individuals with disabilities, women, and African American rights. So she has a lot of interesting perspectives to share with us today as well. And she is also a founder of not one, but two nonprofit organizations that have done some really great work out in the world here in the United States. So we want to have an opportunity to hear a little bit more from Ola about some of that work as well. I'd like to start first with Mark telling us a little bit about what we mean when we talk about marginalized populations. That's a term that we use to describe what we wanted to talk about today. And I thought it might be helpful just to kind of set the context for what we're talking about here. So Mark?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine, and thanks for having me join the chat today. So really simply, I think when we're talking about marginalized populations, the idea here is society has power structures, right? And so we have to ask who has power, who has voice, and for whom are those opportunities lacking? And so when I think of marginalized populations and when we talk about this in this space, I think it's any group of people who feel their voice is underrepresented, especially in the mainstream, right? They may have voice within small pockets of individuals who share similar characteristics or interests, but they're relatively absent or underrepresented in larger social dialogue, representations, media content, et cetera. Their perspective is not being celebrated at the same level as those in the dominant position, which tends to be white males, et cetera, right? So that's just a general overview of that.
Great, thank you. Ola, I'd love for you to share a little bit of your story and the work that you've done in recent years, just to help us understand what your perspective is on marginalized populations and social advocacy and giving a voice to those who may not feel like they have a voice.
Well, thank you for having me. And I'll tell a little bit of my story. I'm a disabled woman, but I was not always disabled. I became disabled at age 9 when I was diagnosed with a rare heart condition, and things manifested a year and a half after that. I became the recipient of a heart and kidney transplant, and I eventually became a wheelchair user. And being subjugated and treated differently inspired my fight and advocacy for people with disabilities, for diversity and inclusion in employment and hiring. I've even worked with the White House, the Obama administration. I was appointed to work on the White House African American Kitchen Cabinet on Disability. And I've worked on nonprofit boards for Lady Gaga's nonprofit, the Born This Way Foundation. And also, I've served as a board member on General Colin Powell's nonprofit, America's Promise Alliance. And in all of my advocacy work, I've advocated for healthcare access, equal access to healthcare, equal employment opportunities for people with disabilities, because we are the largest minority in the United States. And we are an unseen, unstoppable force, and we deserve representation in all facets of society.
Absolutely. Thank you. Mark, I want to come back to you and talk a little bit about when we talk about marginalized populations and we talk about social advocacy. You've done a lot of research in this space. So tell us a little bit about the research that you've done and what you've specifically found happening out there in the last few years.
Sure. So you've opened up a Pandora's box by asking an academic to talk about their research. So I'll try to keep this nice and concise. But basically, as a strategic communication scholar, one of the things that's really been interesting to me is when we're thinking about who has voice, as we well know, the rise of digital communication tools have democratized the ability to bypass gatekeepers and go ahead and communicate openly with a wide audience of individuals. And so I've spent the past few years looking at the rise of selfies on social media as a tool for self-representation, and looking particularly in my work on members of the ostomy community. So individuals who, through medical needs, have a different way of getting rid of their bodily wastes, right? To put it bluntly. And part of the reason I chose that group was they're very active on social media in the use of selfies as a tool to bring visibility to what has historically been a very stigmatized medical condition, and recognizing that not only is it an issue of disability, but it's also one where polite company doesn't like to talk about excrement, right? And so there's this double-edged stigmatization of members of this community that most historically have gone through life trying their best to pass as people without a disability. But as part of this larger kind of disability rights movement, there's been concerted efforts on members of this community to go ahead and demonstrate through self-representation, we are here. Yes, we have ostomies, but we are living full lives. This is not as stigmatizing. And so it's this process of trying to engage in destigmatization, to, if you will, normalize a medicalized condition in a way that removes that stigma so that people don't feel so marginalized if they in fact have this condition. And so it's one of those interesting things where what I've been seeing is, or what I've been trying to track, I guess, is this idea of how selfies, which they themselves have often been marginalized as a mode of communication, something that is a narcissistic act, can actually be a very effective political advocacy tool to bring visibility to marginalized communities because it's self-representation. They don't need any gatekeepers to give them access to expressing their identities in a way that's authentic to them. Rather, they're able to go ahead and self-promote, to create community, to gain both emotional support, educational information. There's a wide variety of benefits of participating in these types of grassroots social movements. But what's also been interesting for me, and something that I'm thinking of, is how historically the gatekeepers have been advertising, communication executives, the fashion industry, et cetera. And there is this interdynamic nature of legitimacy. Individuals from marginalized communities are able to say, we are here, we belong, we are a community, we have power, to Ola's point earlier, and need to be heard. At the same time, there's a lot of those grassroots movements. And so how do brands, how do organizations actually contribute to the legitimization of these marginalized populations, to promote the acceptance of and celebrating the humanity that everybody has by bringing in members of these marginalized populations into their organization as employees, as brand advocates, as producers of their commercials and messages and other things like that. And so that interplay is really at the core of the work I'm doing. So that's kind of an overview. I'll save you from specific findings, but I'll try to integrate those later on as we're talking through some things.
Sure, that's great. Thank you, Mark. This is a subject that is becoming more and more important for marketers, communications professionals in particular to be thinking about. And obviously, there's a lot of interest on the part of brands to bring that representation into what they're doing in the marketplace and, of course, in the workplace too. And I think it can be tricky because we know that employees and consumers really desire to see that representation from the brands that they buy from. And brands want to do that because it's in their best interest. But it also can feel a little self-serving, or if it's not done well, it can come off incorrectly. It can actually do more harm than it does good. And I think that's what a lot of folks here would really like to understand is if we want to do more of this, not just because it's the right thing to do, but just because it's just part of the fabric of society, how can they do that better? What are some things that they should just be aware of and thinking about? And so I think that's probably where we'll start to go with this conversation a little bit more, and some of the things that you and Ola have seen out in the world. So with that, I'd like to ask Ola if you want to share with us a little bit about your perspective on this particular population that we're talking about. And I say particular like it's one particular group, and it's really a pretty broad group. And when we say marginalized, it's not just in terms of physical disabilities. There's all sorts of groups of people who identify in a certain way, who do feel like because of the way they identify, they do not have that voice. So this is a pretty broad and applicable conversation across a lot of different groups. So Ola, tell us a little bit about what you've seen just kind of out in the world and your perspective on that. And we can run through some of the slides that you provided as well.
Okay, let's begin with the inclusive branding. Inclusive branding intends to normalize disability because disability is a part of the human experience, and everyone will eventually become disabled. If you plan on living to old age, chances are you will develop a disability. So this is a community that needs representation and needs representation in media and marketing. Next slide. Globally, there are 1.3 billion people living with disabilities, and the disabled community's global spending power is $6 trillion. It just makes fiscal sense to begin promoting your brands with people with disabilities and including them in your branding, because they have a global spend power that's just as valuable as able-bodied people. The disabled dollar is valuable. Next slide. One of the first brands that I want to talk about is Levi's. Levi's is inclusive of people with disabilities and includes models with disabilities in their ad campaigns. That's important because there's very, very little representation of people with disabilities in fashion. You're just now starting to see fashion shows that feature people with disabilities, people with physical disabilities. But we don't want to exclude anyone who has a hidden disability. As Mark said, ostomy bags, you can't see them. So people can pass as able-bodied with disabilities. So we need to include all facets of disability. Next slide. So Dove's Real Beauty campaign recently featured a woman who's an amputee, and redefining beauty standards to include people with disabilities is of the greatest importance because disability is seen as ugly or a negative. At one point in history, there were ugly laws, literally called ugly laws, where people with disabilities were forced into hiding and could be fined for being seen publicly. So reshaping what beauty is and including disabled bodies in that beauty is what Dove's Real Beauty campaign has done, and it's been pretty successful. Next slide. Target introduced a line of adaptive clothing and furniture for people with disabilities. They've even created a line of adaptive wear for Halloween costumes. Their ads include actual disabled people. And let me say this, in Hollywood, people with disabilities aren't even cast to pay themselves. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the TV show Glee, but they had a person in a wheelchair who wasn't actually disabled. Even Blair Washington had a television show where he was featured as a disabled detective. Instead of actually hiring people with disabilities, they put able-bodied people in wheelchairs and portray them as disabled. Inclusion means including everyone. including people with disabilities. Next slide. The benefits of inclusive branding: you appeal to a broader base of clientele, you increase your revenue, and you grow a customer base that's loyal. Next slide. Teen Vogue has captured the beauty of people with disabilities by featuring 2 disabled models, one Jillian Marcato and number 2, Mama Cox. Mama Cox is the one on the right. She recently passed away, but we will never forget her impact on fashion. She was also a brand ambassador for Rihanna's lingerie line, Savage Fenty. And Jillian Marcato, next slide, you'll see Project Runway has included people with disabilities on their catwalk, on their fashion show. They included specifically a challenge in making adaptive wear for Olympians with disabilities. And those Paralympians were featured on Project Runway. Next slide. Jillian Marcato, as you see again, she was on the cover of Teen Vogue, but she was also selected by Beyonce to advertise her merchandise and model her merchandise. As you can see, I twirl on them haters. It's a powerful statement that Beyonce said, and she wanted to include a model with muscular dystrophy to show that representation matters. Next slide. Starbucks has created a specific store in DC, where I'm from, specifically for people who are deaf. All the employees use ASL and are deaf. The store is dedicated to people united by sign language and deaf culture. People with disabilities have culture. It's our own unique culture that may not be understood by the mainstream, but Starbucks is making sure that they are heard, even if they don't have to use their voices, but using sign. Next slide. Tommy Hilfiger has a line of adaptive wear. And again, we see the model Mama Cox with her prosthetic leg, and a model who's a wheelchair user, and also a model who has Down syndrome. So the tide is changing. Brands are becoming more inclusive of people with disability because disability sells and disability must be recognized. This is my next slide. Zappos created a line of adaptive clothing and created an adaptive coloring book for disabled children to use. This is my final slide, but I will say this. I'm noticing, I'm sorry, not my final slide. Apple's inclusive. My last slide is Apple's inclusive emojis. In these emojis, you see a prosthetic robotic arm, a cochlear implant, a young man with a cane who's clearly visually impaired, a service dog, a prosthetic leg, and a motorized wheelchair. To include people with disabilities is a revolutionary act. And companies are finally starting to see us for who we are and the value that we bring.
Thank you, Ola. That is really helpful to understanding and just seeing some of the things that are going on out there. And many of us have been exposed to some of these, but maybe not necessarily all. I want to take a moment just to encourage everyone. If you have questions or other thoughts that you want to share, please be sure you're putting that in the chat. We're happy to share those with everyone else. So I'm just going to take a quick look here and see. And really, it looks like we have a lot of people who are commenting on, in agreement with everything that you two are saying. We have to start by ensuring that inclusivity you're portraying on the outside is actually lived out on the inside of the organization. That idea of authenticity is just really essential. And I think that is a really important point because, again, if a brand is just focused on making sure they have visual representation as a kind of check the box exercise in their advertising, sometimes that can actually be a little bit more damaging than it is helpful because they aren't necessarily taking into consideration other things such as adapting their environments or thinking about their internal practices such as hiring and maybe customer service, those kinds of things. Are there, you spoke, for example, the Starbucks example I think is so wonderful in that they have an entire store that really is focused on a customer experience for customers who have hearing disabilities. Are there other things like that you all have seen where it's really the brand is going beyond just what they're presenting in their advertising and in their marketing that you think is helpful? Thinking even about products or about the hiring experience that they have for employees. Are there other examples like that you all have seen or heard of that you think are moving us in the right direction?
I can go ahead and speak to that a little bit, not so much from the brand standpoint or other things, but to your point about moving beyond representation. And I want to echo and just support Ola's point. I'm on board that the representation is really kind of in many cases, low-hanging fruit, but you're right that it needs to happen in an authentic way. And I think some of the ways that we can also think about how can brands demonstrate that this isn't just a checklist. Oh, the tide is changing. I need representation here, but to fully engage. Research has shown us for some time when brands are moving beyond the representation to authentically support members of marginalized communities consistently and in a detailed way that reflects the unique lived experiences of members of that community, there's a great benefit, as Ola noted earlier, of loyalty. Right, that members of this community view those organizations and brands as legitimate partners in their social causes. And so if we look back at the LGBTQ community, for instance, Ola mentioned Levi's use of inclusive models with disabilities in their current, more recent campaigns, but they've had a long-standing brand and organizational commitment to issues of inclusivity and diversity, and have been advertising in gay publications since the early 1970s, right? And have continued to support those communities throughout their time. So the point here is not to say you're too late, but rather to think about what are those opportunities. And they did it in very subtle ways early on with what we call polysemic messages that seem very mainstream. But for members of a marginalized community, it has subtext that can be interpreted as more inclusive. And the prime example is old Levi's ads placed in historically gay-friendly communities in the 70s and 80s that showed very fit, toned men with their shirts off and wearing Levi's jeans. To the mainstream audience, that appeared very heteronormative, right? But to members of the gay community, because of its location, because of Levi's ongoing commitment to that community, they understood that message was also very inclusive of them as a community. And then through sponsorship and involvement with Pride and other events, that goes ahead and gets reinforced over time. So while Levi's has this long-standing history, so does Absolute in that particular community. I think a lot of the brands that Ola highlighted, and I have a slide coming up that highlights another brand, it's never too late to start to be that very thoughtful, inclusive brand that is not just including people with disabilities or from different marginalized populations in their messaging, but is truly committed to engaging with those communities in an authentic way to bring their voices to the fore and share those with the world.
Yeah, Mark.
So on the slide,
yeah.
we see Pride from Levi's from 2020, right? And if we can go back quick, Megan, one of the great things about this is a very inclusive gendered ad that shows gender along the spectrum here, right? It is fully inclusive of a number of different gender identities and gender representations that, getting back to some of my scholarship, reflects, yes, typical fashion tropes, but you could also imagine these tiles as selfies, right? And so we see that intersection again of a brand harnessing what has been going on behind the scenes organically among these communities as they harness the power of social media to bring voice to their experiences, and then bringing those into the branded communications in a way that reads authentic, but also is not as likely to raise the whistles of co-optation, of exploitation because of, in this case, Levi's and Absolute's longstanding history in this community?
You know, we talk about authenticity and how critical that is. And I just have to point out that unfortunately, Oreo in their Pride ad, I don't know if you guys can see it, it says made with cream colors that do not exist. That is really unfortunate, I have to say, because I would love to have a rainbow Oreo. I don't know about you guys.
Yeah, it was a amusing disclaimer, all things considered. But the reason I threw the Oreo piece in here too was to show just how subtle sometimes allyship and support for different communities can be. It's a very clever articulation, on brand, but tailored, right, to a very powerful experience for members of this community.
And you use that word allyship, and I love that because I think I think that would be a good starting point for a lot of brands to think about. Don't try to jump in, going too fast and not understanding what it is that you're doing. And if you think of yourself as an ally, I think that is, you can bring some representation in what you're doing as an ally that starts you down the right path without getting into things that perhaps you're not, sure of, or you haven't thought through. That could potentially cause problems. I don't know. I feel like that idea of thinking of yourself as an ally, not just as us individually, but also as a brand, could be a good starting point. What do you guys think of that? Ola? Go ahead.
Go ahead. You first, please.
No, I didn't have anything.
Oh, sorry. I thought I was speaking over somebody. My apologies.
Is it okay if we engage informally? Is that allowed? Or
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm sorry. Is that Amanda? Is that right?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I feel like our branding team, they're on this call. I'm going to humble brag for them. They do a really good job of kind of engaging in these moments. And one of the things that we've been looking at too is how we spend our money, who we spend our money with. And we really dive deep into intersectionality as an intended strategy with any of our engagements, whether it's a marketing brand, a moment we're trying to create with somebody in our organization, or if we're looking at who we spend our money with.
That's a really good point. It's again, back to what I said earlier, it's so much more than just visual representation in an ad, that if you're really going to be authentic about representing and giving voice to marginalized populations, it has to be more thought through than just one part of your overall strategy. I love that. Thanks. So another comment someone had was, it's important in allyship to listen and to amplify voices of marginalized communities, not to speak for them. That's a really good point. Ola, how does that strike you? And have you seen instances where it felt like maybe a brand was trying to speak for a group rather than just to represent their allyship with a group?
Yeah, I've seen disability ads done clumsily, where it's just featuring people with physical disabilities and not inclusive of all disabilities, even the hidden ones. But I wanted to answer a question for companies lacking inclusivity in their organization. Where are the best places to start breaking barriers and knowing things won't change overnight? One of the best things you can do is consult with disability rights organizations. There's this disability, I don't know if it's a non-for-profit, but it's called Disability In, and they work with several Fortune 500 companies to create employment opportunities for people with disabilities. And the first step to inclusivity is hiring people with disabilities. And paying them what they're worth. It's legal in this country to pay people with disabilities sub-minimum wage. You can look on the Department of Labor's website. It's legal to pay them below minimum wage, and people with disabilities aren't paid what they're worth. So transforming your own workforce and hiring people with disabilities to help you lead these campaigns is your best bet.
That's an excellent point. Let's see. I want to make sure I haven't missed any other questions. So Darren, thanks for joining us today. Darren's comment was, one of the issues in engaging allies is there isn't a recognized pride movement for people with disabilities in the same way as LGBTQ and Black Lives Matter. Are there any suggestions on how we can change this? I don't know, Ola, are there groups that you know of, or have you seen any sort of an organizing effort in this area?
Yeah, there are actually disability pride parades, and they happen in June, July, around the anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So there is a disability pride movement. It's just not reported on as much as other pride movements. And it's just, to be honest, being disabled and getting out of your home is difficult enough to be seen and to organize rallies and protests and things like that. It's just very difficult for our community to do, but they are being done.
Great.
In addition, I would add most organizations, so for instance, the Ostomy Awareness organizations, the Crohn's and Colitis organization, a lot of these kind of bowel-related organizations that I'm studying through my work, there's similar awareness months in other organized initiatives. So the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation, for instance, has a campaign that they've been running for the past few years called Get Your Belly Out, which is again kind of reflective of this trend that they've seen in their membership of being willing to post selfies with a shirt raised and a visible ostomy pouch present in an image. And they've kind of codified that in a hashtag that they then go ahead and use as a tool to promote that particular disability related issue through awareness months and other things like that. So I think part of what Catherine and Ola are talking about is one of our first tasks is, and I love the idea, yes, hire, consult with, listen to, but we also have to educate ourselves, right? Just because it's not as visible as Pride. When Pride started, it wasn't visible either, right? And once we start to educate ourselves about all of the initiatives that are going on, we then have the opportunity to potentially figure out in an authentic way, who do we need to reach out to express our interest in getting involved more, right? Not that you have to have the answers, or to the great point earlier, it's not our job to speak for members of these populations. It's rather to amplify their voices. But if we don't know who those voices are, what aspects of their particular experience in culture are relevant to them, are those moments to engage in, how are you going to engage authentically? You have to listen, you have to, to use a word we're all familiar with, you have to do the market research. And as we know, good market research starts with listening. And as Ola was talking about, if you're truly committed, you're going to demonstrate that not just by doing the market research because you want to tap into a market that has value, but you're going to truly embrace this idea and think about how can we be inclusive? How can we celebrate this diversity throughout our organization, throughout our processes, and really make that commitment? That's how you're going to truly communicate to those audiences that you are legitimately interested in them as human beings, that you recognize their marginalized position and want to be an ally in helping raise that visibility. And so again, there's not an easy answer, but I do think there's a lot more going on in these communities than members of mainstream audiences would recognize at first blush, which doesn't mean they're not there. It just means these voices lack the platforms and the visibility to truly raise to the level that other groups have been able to achieve through hard work and diligence over time, right? And the ostomy community, for instance, has that long-standing history of being highly stigmatized, feeling their bodies are not worth being visible, that they are not attractive, are not worthy of love, should not leave the house, those things that Ola was talking about. And so when we see, thank you, Megan, when we see Arie bringing visibility to a number of different disabilities through their Arie Real campaign, which again, from an inclusive standpoint, they put a call out to these communities and said, please apply to be our models. We want to hear from authentic voices, people who are engaging in advocacy at their levels, to go ahead and then bring not just visibility, but to challenge predominant cultural stigmas about people with disabilities, that their bodies are not attractive, that they can't be happy, that they shouldn't be out and visible, and saying, no, here are members of this community and we're celebrating them. And again, I'll just point out a subtle nod. When you look at the various hashtags for the ostomy community where they're posting various selfies, the upper left image, I don't have a note of the model's name, although she's also a spokesperson for the Ostomy Awareness groups that are out there. We see that kind of conventional selfie quite frequently reflected in the grassroots movements. So again, Arie is trying to tap into a larger cultural trend where individuals with disabilities are representing themselves as full human beings who are challenging predominant cultural stigmas associated with their respective conditions. And so the inclusion of a wheelchair user, individual with Down syndrome or diabetes, right? All of these inclusively here, we can say, is Arie checking boxes? Well, maybe you could criticize them for that, right? There's not going to be a universal acceptance of any of these campaigns as well done. But I think by giving voice to people who are actively advocating on behalf of their communities and celebrating them and including them in a campaign that's been going on now for a few years and continues to gain positive reactions from their consumers. Arie saw significant financial benefit from this, but they're committed, right? They're doing this as a response to the lack of inclusion, especially in the lingerie space. And we're seeing other brands, Ola mentioned Rihanna's Fenty by Savage. You know, there's other lingerie brands that are recognizing Victoria's Secret serves a very small segment, right? And gives representation to a very particular body type. How do we become more inclusive of that in this space and recognize that all bodies are beautiful, right? Really important messages that this brand has really kind of committed to moving forward.
Yeah, that's great, Mark. Thank you. So you mentioned something that I wanted just to kind of throw out for some food for thought. You mentioned the importance of educating ourselves and really understanding, and Ola pointed out bringing in people who have different perspectives to be a part of the creation or giving you feedback or part of your research. All of those things are really important, and they help us to educate ourselves as marketers. We do a lot of work for large companies and large employee bases with employee communications and creating materials for employees. And one thing that was just recently brought to my attention that was really helpful was, it was a really simple thing, but when we're developing materials, communication materials for an internal audience, really thinking about just sometimes a person with a disability, for example, might just need more time with information so that they can digest and process the information. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that all of our changes have to be from a representation standpoint. Really, we need to be thinking about accessibility, because that is what drives connection. If people feel they can connect, if they feel that they can interact with the information and they're represented in the information, then there's much more likelihood that they'll really connect with that brand. And so and it's also little things too, that remembering that disabilities take a lot of different forms. I know we were talking specifically about the idea of developing some materials for visually impaired individuals. And of course, as an able-bodied person, my first thought is, of course, people who maybe use a screen reader and how the design is impacted by the use of a screen reader. But it was also brought to my attention that dyslexia, people who have dyslexia, they can see the information, but they process it differently. And so that's one of those examples where it really becomes more about accessibility from the perspective of just giving people more time with information and letting them process it in their own way. And that's an important thing to think about in addition to the representation. We're looking at the possibility of doing a future Shoff Chat on the topic of accessible design because we think it's so important, particularly for more internal audiences, and but also for consumers and brands that are trying to work with consumers to share their story. So, okay, I want to look back at the questions here and see some of the things that were brought up. Let's see. Organizations tend to do top-down communication. One way to bring diversity or disability awareness to leadership and management is to start at HR and to ask to start a diversity committee to discuss these issues. Other ways to promote diversity and disability inclusion is through associations that your organization is associated with. Really good point, Dennis. Thank you for sharing that. Stephanie's question is, can the panelists speak to size inclusivity in a culture that erroneously says fat people are inherently unhealthy? This is a great question, and it's actually, I just read an article yesterday related to this topic, so I'd love to hear what you all think of this particular question.
Well, I think we have to start challenging norms that the thin body is a healthy body. The majority of women in this country are over a size 14. So including fat people in ad campaigns and trying to reduce fat shaming and bullying, cultures of bullying is really important. So marketing directly towards people of a larger size is very important.
Absolutely.
I'll add to that just really quickly. Obviously, like I was mentioning, there are lots of particular movements that are circulating in the online space, and the fat acceptance movement is one of those that research has investigated and celebrated. The fashionistas, as they were branded, people of larger sizes who are trying to push back on those standards that you can't be into fashion if you are of a larger size and other things like that. And so again, that's an example of another community that's engaging in their own proactive self-representation and advocacy that goes under the radar quite frequently. One of the challenges I see in my research, and I'll just be honest about this, brands that are going ahead and dipping their toes, if you will, into the inclusive representation space, I think honestly are a little bit nervous about pushing the norms too far. And so if we look at that Arie campaign again, what you see is young women with traditionally idealized bodies who have one other potential disability or traditionally stigmatized attribute. And I'm seeing this even in my own research in the ostomy community in the grassroots sense, where there is a lack of representation of individuals who have multiple stigmatized characteristics. So you very rarely see larger individuals posting on the site with ostomy pouches. You don't see people who need feeding tubes and have an ostomy represented in those spaces. So there is still certainly cultural norms that people are less likely to go ahead and tread on. And I think from a strategic standpoint, if we're thinking about a social movement, right, you do have to kind of sometimes strategically think about what is going to be beneficial to the cause. And so gaining some visibility, even if it limits, is a step in the right direction potentially. There's critics, of course, that would say, no, let's demonstrate and truly show a commitment to all of the members of the community, not just a select few. And that's a valid critique, right? But I do think we're starting to see potentially a willingness to push those boundaries further. But in these early stages, if you look back, and I think the Arie campaign is a good example of this, there are still normative standards that reflect the ideals of our culture. And, oh, by the way, we'll include this person because they fit those norms, but they have an ostomy pouch. It's not truly representative of the intersectionality of the challenges that many people with disabilities face, where they have multiple disabilities or violate multiple cultural norms that present a challenge for them being fully accepted for who they are in the community.
That's an excellent point, and something that brands should definitely wrestle with to determine what the right thing is, at that in particular moment in time, and for their brand. I want to bring up one other observation and question that Joey shares with us. There's a little bit of background here, and then we'll get into the actual question. A strategic communication situation. A local arts institution recently posted a job opening seeking someone to attract a broader and more diverse audience while maintaining the museum's traditional core white art audience. It quickly spread across social media, and within days, the president had resigned. From a communications standpoint, the dangerous wording is obvious, and news reports indicate that internal employees raised some concerns to the administration about the job description before it went out. If we find ourselves, so here comes the question, if we find ourselves in a situation in which outgoing communications appear to be harmful to members of marginalized and underrepresented communities, do you have any suggestions as to how we can persuade our superiors, the folks who are in the decision-making authority, to change it? What can we do, and thinking about it from an employee or a representative of an organization who maybe isn't driving that, but is aware that it's being considered?
Well, I would build coalitions with other people who agree with you and go as a group and confront the issue, so you don't have to be on your own. Because there are probably more people thinking like you do, who have found offense to it, who might feel strength in numbers as opposed to just doing it individually.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And how often have we all said to ourselves in a situation after the fact, I wish I would have said something, and then someone, 2 or 3 other people say, I was thinking the same thing. And had we only talked about it amongst ourselves and gone together as a group, we might have made a difference. So it's a really good point. Okay, let me see what other questions. So some other comments. Darren says, I agree. We still have issues in organizations where groups are prioritized in terms of D&I strategies, and disability is often not even regarded as a diverse group, as it is seen as more of a medical issue. Social model needs to be adopted everywhere. The Arie campaign is definitely what prompted the thinking on this. And we find a lot of success in using our platform as a customer with vendors to help drive this prioritization as well. That's Amanda made that comment earlier, that when we think about how we give voice to marginalized populations, it's not just in our marketing, but also in how we think about the use of vendors and other partner organizations that we work with as a brand. So that's really a great idea too. Well, we're getting close to the end of our time. So if anyone else wants to throw any other quick questions into the chat, please do so now. I also want to just let everyone know that we will have a Shoff Chat very likely toward the very end of March. We're still finalizing our date on that. But we hope that you will stay tuned for that information. I really want to just take a moment to thank Ola and to thank Mark for the time that you spent with us today. This has been truly helpful and I think invigorating to think about ways that we can take our brands to that next level and truly being authentic. We know that the data out there shows that particularly this next generation of workforce, millennials and Gen Z, they are very focused on making sure that they work for brands and for companies that provide purpose and that represent and that do not have, stigmatization as part of their way of doing business. And so this is just going to continue to be more and more important to the next generation of leaders. And I think we're going to see some interesting evolution in all of this as we go forward. So thank you all for joining us today. Again, we will have a recap of our conversation posted on our website. And for those of you who actually registered for today ahead of time, you will just be getting that in an email that you provided to us. probably early next week. And we really appreciate everyone being with us today, and we hope that you will join us for a future Shoff Chat. Have a great day.